Greetings. I am John Franke, Theologian in Residence here at Second Presbyterian Church, and we have been working through the book by Hart, Who Will Be a Witness? Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. And as promised, here towards the last two chapters, we have the author with us. So welcome to Hart, who is, Associate Professor of Theology at Messiah College. Is that right?
Officially still assistant, but hopefully by February,
Okay,
will be the
so
case.
we're presuming that the promotion is on the way.
Yeah.
So that's great. It's great to be with Drew. His book has been a real challenge, but in a great way for, I think, a lot of us who have been working through it. And it's good to have him with us to walk through the chapter. This chapter is entitled The Things That Make for Peace. And it really gets into some strategies that are faithful to the way of Jesus. And I think it'd be great to start, you kind of allude early in this chapter, getting at some of why you wrote this book, following up with your earlier book on changing the way the church views racism. So maybe you could talk about just why this book and how this chapter sort of starts to get to the heart of that.
Yeah, in some ways, the whole book could have just been this chapter, right? Like I could have just stretched that out. And in many ways, when I was first thinking about writing it, that's what I had in mind. I was engaging a lot of churches around the country who were asking me to come and speak about my first book, Trouble I've Seen. And overall, really great responses to the book. I was actually really quite moved by how seriously not just individuals but even congregations and groups were taking it and reading it together and processing it and wanted to go further. But one of the things that I got asked multiple times was, it was like, all right, so it seems like you want, folks to kind of get into the work of racial justice, and what does that mean? What does that look like? And when I heard that more than one time, it was clear that, we haven't always necessarily in the church given people an imagination for what it actually can look like to do grassroots work of justice, right, in our own neighborhoods. And so that was the spark, the igniting of my mind that there's some further work to be done. And so the whole book, in some ways, flowed out of that, but it was really first me thinking about, can I help people's imagination in terms of different ways beyond just electoral politics, right? Which is what most people were thinking of. What are other ways that we can actually get in the work of justice? And so, that was the inspiration. And so in some ways, it's both a distinct book, but in many ways it also, and this chapter in particular, helps leap from Trouble I've Seen and just that kind of general anti-racism work that I'm helping people kind of imagine.
Yeah, thank you. I really appreciate that. I know in our community here, but in others that I talk to, people always, they read a bunch of books and they're enjoying the books, and inevitably people say, hey, it's great to be learning about all this. What can we do?
Yeah.
And I really appreciate this chapter sort of pushing in the direction of what can we do. You outline really four major approaches that you talk about, and there are others, and I appreciate we'll talk a bit about that towards the end. But you lead off with this notion of nonviolent resistance as struggle, which in some ways, at least if I'm reading you right, this is core to everything else, right? And so I wonder if you just talk a little bit about that. And I think particularly about what people often hear nonviolence, and you mentioned this in the book, they connect it with pacifism. Yeah. But you're really talking about something, and I think you use this language from MLK, that it's even aggressive. So maybe just talk about how nonviolence functions, not simply as kind of passivity.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really helpful point. So for me, when I think about nonviolence or using the language, sometimes I use the language of peacemaking. I'm really thinking about the very life and teachings of Jesus itself, right? And thinking about, and that's why, like in the very beginning of the book, I start with this Jesus's clash with the Jerusalem establishment, right? Like that's huge for me, right? Is how does the actual Jesus story unfold. And for Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the climax of the story is Jesus clashing with the establishment, confronting it, disrupting it, flipping tables, and keep repeating, coming back, right? Not going away until they're like, we've got to crush this problem that we have. And so for me already, just that alone helps me understand that nonviolence or peacemaking in the way of Jesus is actually a disruption of cycles of violence. It's actually a clash with stuff. So it's nothing about passivity at all. And I think, unfortunately, some of the peace church traditions have embodied a vision of peacemaking or peace that really, I don't think actually reflects the kind of radical nature and dare I say, nonviolent revolutionary nature that we see embodied in the person of Jesus Christ. And so for me, that's my starting point is the Jesus story itself, as we see it in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Even John, I joke with John, his clash is not at the end, it's in the beginning. It's like Jesus is so radical, let's just clash with the system right away and get it on, right? And so for me, that's the starting point. And then I'm thinking about it again, not only from a strategic standpoint, but also theologically thinking about, that's why I cling on this language of the things that make for peace, right? I use that in the Barabbas story, then bring it back again. And it's really thinking about peace in this kind of sense of shalom, right? The things that bring the kind of wholeness and justice and peace and reconciliation that's kind of envisioned, the flourishing of all creation, right? That's envisioned in the kind of Hebrew Bible for a vision of shalom, that is, our orientation, that's what we're driving towards. We're trying to move and get a glimpse of God's dream for all of creation and then strive towards that and make that as much of a reality as we're able to. And so, yeah, for me, an embodied way of life that's Jesus shaped, that's oriented towards striving towards that kind of full shalom in which there's healing and justice for everyone.
I really like the way you talk about the need to do this, and you've used this as you're speaking, but to engage in this struggle and this resistance in the ways that are faithful to Jesus. You make the point in the chapter that if we're going to pursue the things that make for peace, we not only have to employ strategies and get active, but we have to do it in a Jesus-shaped way. And, so many of when we think of revolutionary struggle, we often don't think about this sort of Jesus-shaped way. Could you just comment a bit more about that?
Yeah. So if it's the things, I'm really thinking, I'm taking that phrase very seriously, right? To think, I guess you could say eschatologically, right? About like where do I believe that God is ushering creation towards something, right? And if that is something is shalom, and I believe that God is able somehow, it doesn't matter what your particular theology on God and how God works. If you believe that God is able and is not going to leave us alone and is going to see this through to the end, right? Where freedom and justice come. If we have faith in that, then we want to participate in what God is doing in the world. And it's to believe that there are some things that are actually in congruency with, the way that God is actually working in the world, participating in the delivering presence of God in the world. That's what I want to join in with, right? I want to be moving and working with how God is working within the world. And so as the Holy Spirit is at work, helping to inspire people to love and to stand up for justice and to speak truth, I want to be a conduit and a participant in that work. And so the things that make for peace, for me, have to take seriously the life and teachings of Jesus, right? That Jesus is the very definition of the things that make for peace for Christians. And so it's, in some ways, it's both the particular and the kind of universal of the significance of Christ, right? The particular of Christ in terms of the very way that Jesus was revealed, his incarnation, the very way that he lived and moved in this world and challenged violence and oppression. But then to also acknowledge that this is the cosmic Christ, right? At the exact same time. And that we believe that there's a particular way that God is working in the world and that we want to join in with that way that God is moving the whole universe towards shalom. Yeah.
Great. Yes. You talk in this chapter a bit about some of the foundational points of view that shape this, and one of them is enemy love. I want to come back to that in the next chapter, because chapter 9 really gets into that more deeply. After you talk about nonviolent resistance as struggle, you mentioned 3 other movements, and I want to, or strategies, and I want to take the next 2 together, because I think they are connected. And that's, you talk about social movement protest and then organizing people power.
Yeah.
And both of those involve getting communities, groups of people involved in important ways. But I like the way that you talk about the strengths and weaknesses of each. And I wonder if you just might say a bit about that, just unpacking that a little bit, how social movement protests can be powerful, but some of the limitations, and then ways in which community organizing is, in a sense, the long-term game, but it has challenges too. So maybe just share a bit about those two.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, and I'll try to use like examples, right, that we can all resonate with. So, some of the big stuff we think about, like the Occupy movement, right? That was, I don't know, maybe 10 years ago, right? As it was happening, right? And all of a sudden, before we knew it, right, there are people camping out on Capitol grounds all across the nation, in tents and stuff. And it actually sparked, I mean, you think about how quickly it spread and how it sparked so much conversation in the national dialogue for a short period of time. And so, in fact, I often say, like, sometimes as much as we could be negative about, how structured or the lack of structure that there was there, like, since that point, there's been much deeper conversations around economics, right? Around the 1%, right? That's a term that developed out of there that is still, even, folks openly proclaiming to be, democratic socialists, right?
Right.
I don't think that was possible prior to the Occupy movement. So they came into the scene. It was this kind of space in which people could participate, and in different ways, right? Like, you could, the kind of real radicals are camping out. But other people are just coming and showing up and marching at different points and stuff like that. And so there was this space for wide participation. And I think that one of the things that movements do really well is create a kind of sense of safety because of the numbers, that people can join in and participate. And so there's no long-term commitments, you can just show up, you can just join in, and it kind of usually taps into this momentum, this stuff that's in the air, right? And so I think those are some of the strengths that protest movements have. But like I said, there's no commitment, and with no commitments and without structure, things can often be short-lived. And so usually protest movements are not around for the long haul. They come and they go, they have their shelf life, and then all of a sudden they're just as gone. Like, the whirlwind is over and everyone goes back their own separate ways. And so when you need things to be worked on beyond when they're popular and when there's energy behind it, when ongoing work needs to be done, you can't count on protest movements to be there as the reliable friends that's going to keep doing the work. And so that's the strengths and weaknesses, I think. And we've seen that many times. I think we could say the same thing about at least aspects of the Black Lives Matter movement. We've seen it up and rise. We've seen that with Me Too, up and down in terms of these rises, and then kind of just disappearing in terms of the large, where are all these people, right, that were marching and rallying? Protest movements just aren't capable of carrying us through all the way. But when we think about organizing is really rooted in the idea of structure and being organized, right? That's the language itself. And so there's structure, there's leadership, there's kind of more direct planning. There's usually, you do one-on-ones with your neighbors and hear people's stories and find out where their needs are within the community, let people express it themselves. And that kind of approach, starting with people and their stories and where the needs are being felt most, doesn't require you to start with what's, on the news. It doesn't have to be on the news at all for you to start doing this work in your neighborhood, right? And to bring people then together to create an agenda of what are the big issues that you want to address first. Usually organizers start small to demonstrate that, your people power, right? You bring people together and that they have a collective power together to actually bring change. And then they build and grow from there. And so organization, I think it's particularly fascinating when you think about it in terms of power, because usually we think about power in terms of top down, but this is really bottom up, dispersed power being concentrated and directed and strategized to bring ongoing change in a community. And so usually to participate, you need to commit to something. You're signing up, you're in work groups, you're in it for the long haul. And so that's really the power of it. They're usually not trying to bring like overnight change. Just imagine that it's like we're going to take piece by piece. We're coming to bring the change that's necessary. And so, yeah, organizing has that. But on the other hand, there are some weaknesses, right? Traditional, like Saul Alinsky style organizing is very rigid in terms of philosophically or methodologically, right? Like there's this sense in which, this is how we do the work. And usually there's a very negative kind of perception of movements and activists and stuff like that. And the problem with that kind of rigidity is that when there are sometimes these great opportunities where change can happen, like their leadership actually would actually be quite helpful. And sometimes in those critical moments, they're out of just philosophical differences, they don't want to get involved. And so then you have folks who just show up and they don't know what they're doing and they have no long-term vision. And so I think there's really an opportunity that's missed. Now, I will say that certainly what I've seen is that a lot of the organizers now, there's a lot more self-awareness around this problem. And so you are seeing a lot more flexibility among groups that are not trying to be as rigid in terms of the method. And so I think the more that happens, the better. And so, yeah, I don't dismiss either. I think that both of them have brought change. And even in the movement stuff, like people who have participated in rallies and movements and march and stuff like that, just because we don't see them still doesn't mean that they don't carry some of that stuff with them, right? Back to their organizations, back to their different communities and spaces that they're a part of and relationships. And so I think we can sometimes overclaim failure, even though I do think we do need ongoing sustainable work. I do think that there's sometimes more stuff going on behind the scenes as well. So they both have their strengths, they both have their weaknesses. And I think that the more that we can learn from the different strategies, participate and prepare for what's coming, that we can really continue to make a difference. But they're both viable options for churches, right? Churches, there's chaplains for movements and there's faith-based organizing work that's really popular. And so there's lots of different ways to get involved for churches and individuals, of people of faith that want to get involved with what's happening right there in their own neighborhoods.
Thanks. I think one of the most fascinating parts of this chapter, and I imagine things that will, generate conversation, is your whole discussion of electoral politics, which you acknowledge, we've got to wrestle with this. But it's interesting that you open that section by talking about one Christian strategy is to not vote. And you mentioned that, at first glance, you yourself thought, wow, that doesn't seem very faithful, but then talk about the ways in which that actually can be a faithful response. And then, of course, the other side, how do we vote? And you acknowledge that this is tricky. I wonder if you just take a minute or two and just track out some of it. And again, I know you can't do justice to all the detail, and hopefully folks are reading it, but I just think it'd be interesting to hear a few thoughts about that. And especially for churches where, for some places, you start talking about any of this stuff and people immediately think, oh, you're getting political. And then you talk about voting and they're sure you're getting political. And you're wanting to say, hey, this is really important. Maybe just share a few thoughts on that.
Yeah, I mean, so voting. So number one, I won't name names, but I do have some friends who do not vote, right? And not the kind of lazy I don't vote or disengaged I don't vote. Like these are actually some of the most politically active people I know, right? Who do not vote. But their non-voting is a condemnation of the entire system itself, right? And so they kind of, I mean, I guess you could call them like anarchist leaning kind of folks. But politically active, engaged, organized, like they'll do all kinds of stuff on the ground. So to say that they're disengaged or irresponsible to the realities of our society would not actually describe their lives, right? I think they're actually, while most people who vote, so you do your one, November comes around and you vote your one time and then you go back and don't worry about it for the rest of the year,
Right.
other than like, getting heated about stuff. Like they're living this out every day on the ground. And so I do think that their examples for me have actually challenged my imagination in terms of even thinking about the conversation altogether, because I would say most of the folks that I know, again, that have taken that position thoughtfully, carefully, with integrity, are more politically engaged and take more responsibility for what's going on in society than most people that I know that do vote, right? That said, I do vote, right? But I do think that they present a challenge for us to think about the politics of Jesus, right? To think about the reign of God and how do we embody that on the ground every day in radical ways that are seeking to bring social change. And I think that that is a good starting point. I think for many of us, one of the big challenges is that we have so internalized the partisan fights that are going on in our society. And so most of what we think or what we claim to be Christian ethics really are just prepackaged political platforms, right, from the Republican or Democratic Party that we're espousing. We don't have a really distinct Jesus-shaped political imagination. So I do think I like to separate partisanship from political, right? Political is us being engaged with the polis, the city, the way our society is organized and how it impacts people, right? That's what we're really getting at. And you, I don't know how you can be a follower of Jesus and not be political in that sense. But that doesn't necessarily mean that we have to be puppets to political parties, right? And to the partisanship in terms of just the talking points and all that stuff, and we just get lost in that. And I do think that instead, we have other, sometimes even more radically political positions that come out of deeply immersing ourselves in the birth, life, teachings, death, and resurrection of Jesus Christ, right? As it relates to the poor, as it relates to the least, last, and lost, those that are stigmatized and marginalized, those that are being crushed by empire. I think that we have commitments, and even as we'll talk about in the next chapter, what does it mean to love, right? All these things have deep political implications, and I think we have just, brainwashed and just too oversteeped in just the 24-hour news cycle, and it's just not helpful for our own kind of political. It's actually domesticated. It's not like sometimes we think, you're being too well, what I'm talking about is we're actually having a domesticated version of what the church ought to look like, given what our society is right now. And so, anyway, my hope is that
thank you.
Recover the vision.
Yeah, that's I like the way you end the chapter. You talk about a collaborative and hybrid approach, and saying all of these are helpful. None is the only way to do it. And I think also inviting even the possibility of further imagination for new strategies. And I like the way you say what we need to do is be worshiping the one true God, immersing ourselves in scripture, the story of Jesus, and also the stories of the oppressed. And that out of that, new creative imaginations for doing justice can emerge. And I think that's so important to get away from the, like you say, the pre-packaged, here are the 3 things or 4 things that you're going to do, and think that you've taken care of everything, because there's obviously lots of people and stories that are not covered by those prepackaged. I wonder if you just want to comment on that as we
Yeah.
close.
I mean, all I'll say is I'll use close with thinking about Brian Stevenson's always the one that I think of, right? In terms of just, a lawyer who's kind of just not refused to stay in his lane, right?
Yes.
And so now he's got like this lynching memorial. He's helping to tell a different story in terms of the landscapes that we live on and help us tell a more honest, truthful story about our nation's history, creative media, books, right? And I think that that is the kind of really beautiful imagination we can have for our own communities, that aren't just about, the partisan politics, but something much deeper and more beautiful that invites us to see God's dream.
All right. Thank you, Drew. Appreciate your time. This was chapter 8 from Drew's book, Who Will Be a Witness? And we will, in our next video, we will look at the last chapter of the book. So I hope that you folks watching have enjoyed this brief interaction. Obviously, there's more detail in the book, so hopefully you'll read that. There are discussion questions from the study guide, and we will see you in the next episode. Peace. Hold on.